Hello, my name is Tim Shoebridge, and these are my thoughts on the Moog Matriarch. Right, now before we continue with the video, I just want to take a minute or so to explain what this video is not. And this video is not a review of the Matriarch. There are people that have done full reviews of it already out there on the internet. I don't think there's any point in me duplicating what they've already done. What I thought might be beneficial with this video is to give you my thoughts and my impressions about the Matriarch, having used it in anger for quite a few months now. And yes, that means it's going to be about my opinions. It's going to be what I think is good about it, what I think is not so good about it, what could be improved in the future. So I appreciate that my opinions may not be the same as yours, and that's absolutely fine. But please bear that in mind, that that is what this video is going to be about. Now, although I'm not going to do a full review of the synth, I think it's worthwhile just talking about the overall architecture of the Matriarch. Because if you're in the market for a synthesizer right now and you're looking at the Matriarch, I think it's very important that you understand what sets the Matriarch apart from the competition. So that is what's coming up next, as usual. Thank you very, very much for watching. Okay, so in terms of the architecture, we start with our voltage controlled oscillators, all four of them. And the outputs from those four VCOs goes into a mixer section. Now that mixer section also has a fifth input, which is a separate noise source. So we have 5 separate audio inputs, mono inputs into a mixer, and we have a single monophonic output from the mixer. That output goes into a filter section, which contains 2 discrete voltage-controlled filters. We'll go into the filter section in a little bit more detail in a minute. But crucially, coming out of the filter section is actually a stereo signal path. We've got left and right channels coming out of the filter section at that point. And those channels go into an amplifier section where we have a pair of VCAs. And then the signal path passes on from the amplifier section into the delay section where we have a pair of bucket brigade delays. And from that point, we have our stereo output out of the synth to the outside world. So crucially here, from the filter section onwards, we have a stereo signal path. And that makes the Matriarch, for me, very, very special. Right, let's talk about the filter section in a little bit more detail and see what's going on in there. We've actually got 3 separate modes that the filter can work in. Now in the first mode I'm going to talk about, VCF number 1 acts as a high-pass filter and VCF number 2 acts as a low-pass filter. And those 2 filters are connected in series, which means the mono output from the mixer first goes into the high-pass filter, then the signal passes into the low-pass filter, and then the mono signal from the low-pass filter is applied equally to the left and right channels that are coming out of the filter section. That means that we have a monophonic output from the filter section. Now there's a second mode where we have high-pass filter and low-pass filter, but in this case those filters are connected in parallel. So we have our mono output from the mixer passing equally into both the high-pass filter and the low-pass filter. The outputs from those filters are then combined back to a mono signal and then applied equally to the left and right channels coming out of the filter section. So again, we have a monophonic output. Now the third mode is one where we have both VCFs acting as low-pass filters. They're connected in parallel, but crucially, with this particular mode, the outputs from each of the low-pass filters are kept separate. VCF number 1 goes to the left channel and VCF number 2 goes to the right channel. So in this particular mode, we actually have a true stereo output. Now, I know in that last section I kept the architecture diagram really quite simple, and I did that on purpose to emphasize the stereo nature of the synth. I didn't mention envelope generators, LFOs, sequencer, arpeggiator, MIDI to CV conversion, all of that stuff. And I didn't mention the different playing modes, the unison monophonic mode, the duophonic mode, and the 4-note paraphonic mode. It's this 4-note paraphonic mode that everyone has been talking about ever since the Matriarch was first announced, and comparing it to the great vintage Korg monopoly. But if we just come back to the stereo nature of the synthesizer just for one more minute, and we look at that original architecture diagram that I put together, if there's one thing that I'd really like the Matriarch to have, and it doesn't have it, that would be a true stereo mixer section. So if the stereo signal path started at the mixer, then that would mean that we would be able to sort of pan our VCOs left and right, place them within the stereo field, and have a really true stereo sound all the way from the VCOs all the way out of the synthesizer. And then for me, the Matriarch wouldn't just be an evolution of the Korg monopoly, but it would also be an evolution of the Dave Smith Instruments Evolver and Poly Evolver as well. And what I'm going to do next is just look at a few different sort of hands-on aspects of the synthesizer with you. I'm going to look at the filters again and do a little bit of patching with them. I'm going to look at the bucket brigade delay, and I'm also going to look at the sequencer section as well, just very, very briefly. There's just a few little things that I'd like to sort of mention with those three sections, and that's what's coming up next. Right, for me, this filter section in the center here, this is where I spend an awful lot of my time noodling and fiddling around and patching. And one of the main reasons for that is this is where the sort of the stereo signal path starts. You've got these two filters inside this one section here, and you've got stereo low pass filter mode. And there's an awful lot of wonderful sort of stereo effects that you can get from fiddling around with the filters in this mode, but equally you can get some really quite fantastic modulation effects, being able to modulate each of the filters independently from one another in any of these three modes here. So I just want to spend just a few minutes just showing you a couple of things, sort of like my favorite things to do with the filter section. So the first thing I just want to mention, it might be obvious, it might not, but you can get at the filters individually if you want to. So here we're in stereo mode, we're hearing both of them together. Here we are in series mode and we're hearing both of them together. But what if we just want the low pass on its own or the high pass on its own? The simplest way to do that is to patch it with just one cable. We've got at the top here inputs to each of the filters individually. VCF in for number 1 and then for number 2. So if I just switch it to parallel mode, if I just take a patch cable and put it into one of those patch points and not connect it to anything else, I'm basically bypassing the normal routing from the mixer into VCF2. And all we're hearing there is the high pass filter, which is VCF1 in this particular mode. If I put it into the other input, now we're just hearing the low pass filter, which is VCF2 in this particular mode. Now, we've got, in terms of controls for these two filters, we've got one sort of master cutoff control. We've got individual resonance controls, but just the one cutoff. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to put it into drone mode, free up my hands. And I switched it into stereo. Very subtly it's stereo, but actually both filters are sweeping at exactly the same time, so it's not really much of a stereo effect. We've got individual resonances, so we can create differences between them. And that gives us an enhanced stereo effect. But if we want to have the cutoffs of the filters different to each other, then the way we do that is with this spacing control here. And what this spacing control does is create an offset between the cutoff of filter 1 and filter 2. So let me just demonstrate that to you. So if I just turn it towards the right, positive, you'll hear that the left channel is getting louder. That's because that cutoff of filter number 1 is increasing relative to filter number 2. We can still sweep them both, but we're now sweeping them at different cutoff frequencies. But it's a sort of a fixed offset. And if I go towards the left, negative, you'll hear that the right channel is getting louder. So cutoff frequency of VCF2 is greater relative to VCF1. Now, if we don't like using this control, there's a very easy way of having complete hands-on control of both cutoffs of these two filters. And the way to do that is with some patch cables. So if I take these attenuators, so we've got one over here, we've got two over here. What I'm going to do is just take the output from this attenuator and put it into the cutoff in of filter number 2, and then I'm going to do this attenuator output into cutoff of number 1. Now, just without any other patching, I've got control of each cutoff frequency individually. And that will work in any of these three modes. We're in stereo right now, but let's go to parallel. I'm controlling the high pass filter cutoff and the low pass. So that leads me on to one more thing I want to show you, and that is one of my favourite ways to patch the synth is with these two cables in place, but I add two more. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the LFO over here, take its triangle output and put it into this attenuator, and I'm going to take the main LFO over here and take its output and put it into this attenuator. So now what I can do is individually, I'm doing this in stereo mode for effect, individually modulate the cutoff frequencies of each of the filters. Okay, so finally, let's just talk about the stereo delay. It's a very similar kind of situation to the filter section. You've got two individual delays, and they're affecting the left and the right channel, and you have a single set of controls. So you've got an overall time control, but then you have a spacing control, which means you can offset the delay time of delay number 1 versus delay number 2. So I'm just going to show you something a little bit wacky and weird. I've got the LFOs going into two attenuators, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the output from one attenuator and control the time of the delay number 2, the right hand delay, and then I'm going to, with a longer cable here, affect time of delay number 1 with this other attenuator over here. So I'm just going to play a little sequence so you can hear the sort of the slightly wacky effect that we get now that we are able to control the times of each of those delays separately. So just to mention, just before we finish here, that the filter has direct inputs to filter number 1 and number 2, and the stereo delay also has inputs directly into delay number 1 and delay number 2. And the VCA, that the amplitude envelope effects, has also got direct inputs into VCA number 1 and VCA number 2. So irrespective of the sounds coming out of this synthesizer and its VCOs, etc., you can use this synth as a standalone stereo filter effect, a standalone stereo delay effect, or both of them combined. I saw someone in the comment section of one of my videos talking about the price of the Matriarch and asking, can you use these two components separately? Because if you look at the cost of the Bucket Brigade Delay Mooga pedal, it's really quite expensive and quite rare these days. And yes, you've got a stereo delay effect here, and you've got a stereo filter as well. Obviously you can use them in stereo mode, or you can use them as a pair of mono effects. So you've got an awful lot of sort of like external audio effects capability with the synthesizer, even if you sort of like completely disregard its 4 VCOs. The last section I want to cover is actually the sequencer over here on the left hand side. I don't use the sequencer very much. In fact, I don't use the sequencer of any synthesizer very much. I've got my DAW and my PC, and that's sort of central to my sort of like workflow. But there's just something cool that I found with this sequencer, which I just wanted to demonstrate to you. Just a little thing that I found with it. So it's a polyphonic sequencer. You can record up to 4 notes at a time. You obviously need to be in 4 voice mode when you play that back, otherwise it's not going to sound the way you recorded it. But the thing I just want to show you is that I've got 2 sequences that I've recorded. I'll put the hold button on and press a key. Okay, so this is the first one, a little monophonic sequence. And I'll switch to the other one. That's the poly sequence. And you'll hear there that it just keeps perfect time as you switch between sequences. You've got to get the switch right in between the notes, but it doesn't have to be dead accurate. I wasn't dead accurate at all then. I missed a note. I just thought that was pretty cool. I think from a sort of live performance point of view, it's very handy that it keeps time. It doesn't have to keep time, but the fact that they've done it, I think is really good. Now, if you've seen any of my previous videos on the Matriarch, my little bite-sized videos that I put together, or if you've seen my grandmother video where I do talk about the Matriarch a little bit, then you'll know that I absolutely love this synthesizer. And there are 4 basic reasons why I love it. The first reason is simply the sound of the oscillators, the filters, the amplifiers, and the delay section. It's got a lovely, rich, creamy, beefy kind of sound, a vintage kind of sound. It just really sounds absolutely wonderful. And talking of the sound, the second reason why I love it is the thing that I've been banging on about a lot in this video so far, which is the stereo signal path. From the filter all the way through to the outputs, you've got stereo capability, and that adds a real extra dimension to the sounds that you can get out of this synthesizer. Thirdly, talking about extra dimensions, we've got 4-note paraphonic mode. That really does add an extra dimension to a synthesizer. You can use it in so many more situations than you could a mono synth. You can play 4-note chords or 3-note chords with a bass line. It's just a wonderful capability to have, and not that many synthesizers have it. The fourth reason why I love the Matriarch is it's a serious semi-modular synthesizer. It takes modular gear seriously. It's got loads of patch points, not just on the top, but on the back panel as well. There's an awful lot you can do to craft the sound that you want, and that's even before you start looking at integrating it with Eurorack gear. So those are the 4 reasons why I love the synthesizer, but this is not going to be a 100% positive discussion about it. There's one thing about this synth that I really do not like at all, and that is called global settings. Right, what I'm showing you here is the first global settings page in the Matriarch user manual. And I'll just scroll down so you can see sort of like tables and tables and tables of settings that you can make. There are actually 46 in total, 46 settings that you can change. Now, the Matriarch doesn't have a display of any description. So there's no way of accessing these global settings through some sort of menu option. There's not even a little numerical display like you'd get on, say, a Prophet 6 or an OB6 for that matter. So the only way that you can set global settings is to use key press combinations on the physical keyboard. Now, the first 10 settings don't require key press combinations, but the rest of them do. So that's 36 different key press combinations to access a single parameter that you then change the value of by pressing a white key. So you hold down 2 black keys to access a parameter and then press a white key to change the value. Now, the issue I have with this whole thing is that there's no way of knowing what the value is before you set it or after you set it, other than you knowing what it is by the behavior of the synthesizer. Now, this way of setting global settings through key presses is nothing new to Moog. They've got it in their other synthesizers as well. I've got the sub-fatty, and you do the same kind of thing to set global settings. With the sub-fatty, there's also a software-based editor / librarian where you can make those changes in a far more intuitive and safe manner. With the Matriarch, there is no software, not that I'm aware of. So I think that it's an issue because the more and more settings that you have to set, the more and more key press combinations there have to be, and then the more and more potential there is for error. So let's say, for example, you want to make a setting. It's been a long day, you're tired. Instead of holding down D sharp, you hold down C sharp, followed by G sharp. That accesses a parameter that's the wrong parameter, but you don't know what that parameter is, and then when you change the value, you don't know what parameter value you've just set because you're thinking it's something else. You've got no way of knowing what that was. It's now done, and that setting is now permanent, which means you switch the Matriarch off, switch it back on again, and that wrong setting is still there. And the only way you'll know about it is if you happen to stumble across the behavior of the synthesizer changing and realize, oh, that's not the way it should be, let me go and set it back again. And even if you don't make a mistake, let's say you set the value correctly, I might change the clock setting on the synth. It might be tomorrow, next week, or in a few weeks or a month's time, I want to do something with the synth, and I just want to know what the clock setting is that I've set. There's no way of knowing what it is. There's no display. You have no idea. So I think this whole thing with global settings is an issue. The more settings that you have, and 46 settings is an awful lot of settings, and it also sort of like shows you how much firmware there is inside the synthesizer. You know, you think it's a fully manual voltage controlled synthesizer, semi-modular, there won't be much firmware in there, but actually there is a lot of firmware in there. And it's only once I started to make some global setting changes that I came across some very, very weird and strange behavior with the synthesizer, where I think I had at least 2 or 3 different bugs. Now, I don't want to talk about those bugs. I need to go back and do the same thing again, recreate the issues that I had, document them, and then I need to talk to Moog technical support about them and see what they say. And I haven't done that. But certainly I've uncovered instability issues with the synth having made global setting changes. So that kind of worries me, the level of testing that has been done on the Matriarch before it was released. I'm assuming most people that tested it didn't go into all the global settings, make changes, because otherwise they would have uncovered these bugs that I have found. So anyway, that's the sort of the negatives of the Matriarch out the way. Global settings for me is a bit of an issue. I'm a bit concerned about them, and I think that if Moog were to come out with a software editor that allowed you to make those changes safely and see so you could see what those changes are, I think it would make a big, big difference. Right, so I think I've pretty much covered everything I wanted to say about the Matriarch in this video. I was originally thinking about doing a little section in the video where I compared the Matriarch to its closest competitor, which, let's face it, is the Behringer Poly D. But although the Poly D has been announced, it's not yet released. I don't have one. I didn't get early access to one either, so I can't really talk with any authority about the Poly D. I'm interested in it, certainly. I'm a little bit concerned about oscillator tuning variation. There's a certain amount of tuning fluctuation going on in the Behringer Model Ds. I've owned a number of those over the years. I'll be interested to see how Behringer have looked at that issue in terms of the Poly D, because let's face it, if you're holding down a single note and you've got oscillator tuning fluctuation, it can sound really cool. But if you're holding down a whole chord and you've got some tuning instability and you've got each VCO associated with a different note, then it can actually sound really quite terrible. So I'll be interested to see how Behringer have solved that issue, or at least modified the Poly D compared to the original Model Ds. But you really can't compare the Matriarch with the Poly D. The Matriarch has that true stereo signal path that only the highest end analog synthesizers have, and it's also a real serious semi-modular synthesizer. It's got a lot of patch points, and there's an awful lot that you can do with this synthesizer even before you look at integrating it with Eurorack gear. So that's really it. That's all I want to say about the Matriarch. It is a wonderful synthesizer. Yes, it is expensive, but you're getting what you pay for, honestly. So that's it. Until the next video, until the next synthesizer I choose to have a look at, as always, thank you very, very much for watching.